So I'm starting my journey here at This Is the Place Monument in Salt Lake City. This is the actual end spot of the Mormon Trail. I'm talking about this trail because it is important to me personally. I have taught leadership development for years. I believe that pilgrimage can teach us something about ourselves as leaders. And as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and having been raised in Salt Lake City, this Mormon Trail is, to me, a pilgrimage. It's a pilgrimage not just from the ancestors of the pilgrims who journeyed here, but of every member of the church, because it represents several key elements to their key faith. Including those is the restoration of what they believe was the original gospel of Jesus Christ, given authority to restore that church and to gather the people of the gospel of Jesus Christ to a place where they could build Zion. That included a physical spot, which at the end spot became this city here and all the colonies around here that they developed, but it also became a spot in heaven where they would build temples, a house of the Lord on the earth, where they would perform sealing ordinances to bring families together so that this Zion on earth would be replicated in heaven. So join me on that pilgrimage as we go back to the beginnings of this trail somewhere along the banks of the Mississippi River, some 1,200 miles to the east of me. The Mormon Trail, or the LDS pilgrimage, begins more or less at this very spot, with Nauvoo behind us, Nauvoo, Illinois, and Iowa across the Mississippi River. This is the spot where the Mormon pioneers left their beloved city Nauvoo and began their trek to the Rocky Mountains in the west. But in reality, it begins some 900 miles to the east of here and about 26 years earlier. The Mormon pilgrimage really starts here. I'm in a small town named Palmyra in upstate New York. Imagine it's the year 1820, and in front of me is a family farm, the Smith family farm. They moved here on a homestead of 100 acres. Behind me is a grove of trees that was on the family farm. A young boy named Joseph Smith, 14 years of age, went to this quiet grove of trees behind me to ask forgiveness for his sins and to ask his Father in heaven which church he should join. At that moment, young Joseph received a vision of God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ, who answered his question to tell him not to join any church at that time. He told them that although they had a likeness of the truth, that they lacked the fullness of the gospel, and that he would become an instrument in restoring God's church upon the earth. To understand any pilgrimage, I believe you first have to understand the underlying values that drive people to take that pilgrimage. It is values that drive pilgrims to action. And to understand why thousands of converts traveled across the world and across the United States to Salt Lake City along the Mormon Trail, one has to understand what happened here first. This is the beginning spot. And I believe there are really three core values that were revealed to Joseph in this spot that began here. One is that we all can have a personal knowledge of God, that we can all have a personal relationship with God, and that the purpose of the Mormon Trail and the Mormon gathering was to understand God more perfectly. The second one, which I'll show shortly, is the restoration of priesthood power. And that the restoration of that priesthood power brought about a sealing of families, that families could be united in this earth and in the next together. And third is the concept of a gathering, the concept of building a new Zion upon the earth, a place where members could join together in strength, to strengthen themselves, to strengthen their families, to better understand God, and to do his will on earth. Those are the three underlying values that drove the gathering and that are the essence and the core values that drive the Mormon experience and the Mormon Trail, or in my words, the Mormon pilgrimage. And that is why this spot is the beginning of it all. In the years following Joseph's first vision near Palmyra, Joseph came here, near the banks of the Susquehanna River, where he began the translation of the Book of Mormon. He and his assistant, Oliver Cowdery, were pondering one verse in the Book of Mormon related to baptism. And he realized that they didn't have the authority to baptize or act in the Lord's name. It was because of this verse that they went to the woods near here to ask the Lord what they should do and to ask the Lord about the authority to baptize. In response, Joseph and his assistant received 2 visitations. The first was John the Baptist, who conferred upon Joseph and Oliver Cowdery the authority to baptize. Later on, they were visited by Peter, James, and John. And at that time, they conferred upon them the same authority that Jesus conferred upon his original apostles. It was with that authority that Joseph then was able to establish his church and send missionaries out to the entire world to begin the gathering place, to begin gathering saints from all over the world and building Zion upon the earth. The trail of the history of the Restoration continued shortly after the restoration of the priesthood, when in 1830 the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was officially established here at the Whitmore Farm in rural New York, with the purpose of spreading the gospel message to the entire world. Shortly after the establishment of the church, the prophet Joseph Smith said, "The standard of truth has been erected. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Persecutions may rage, mobs may combine, armies may assemble, calumny may defame, but the truth of God will go forth boldly, nobly, and independent, till it has penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, and sounded in every ear, till the purposes of God shall be accomplished, and the great Jehovah shall say, the work is done." Shortly after the official establishment of the church in New York, Joseph received a new commandment from the Lord, telling him to move his people to Ohio. In that revelation, the Lord said, "For this cause I give unto you the commandment, that ye shall go to the Ohio, where I will give unto you my law, and there ye shall be endowed with power from on high." Upon arrival in Kirtland, Ohio, the Lord told Joseph to organize, prepare every needful thing, and to establish a house, even a house of prayer, a house of fasting, a house of faith, a house of learning, a house of glory, a house of order, a house of God. That house is the building behind me. It is the first temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this house and its construction required great sacrifice and great perseverance from his people. Historians have said that based on the per capita income and wealth of the people at the time and the cost of the construction of this building, of this temple, that it was by far the most expensive construction of any temple that the church has ever built. As any pilgrim knows, that the pilgrimage itself is not the journey, not the enlightenment that comes from a pilgrimage. The pilgrim experiences enlightenment, empowerment, and a new knowledge and a new awakening from the sacrifice of the journey. I believe there were 2 reasons for the Lord asking this building to be built. First, it was going to be a temple where all the power, all the authority, and all the keys related to the gathering of his people in the last days would be given to his prophet and to his people. And secondly, and perhaps just as importantly, it was an opportunity for those people to experience that sacrifice, that pilgrimage sacrifice, that sacrifice that pilgrims feel as they gain enlightenment. Unfortunately, this enjoyment, this endowment, this knowledge wouldn't last long, for within about a year and a half after the completion of this building, because of apostasy and because of infighting within the church, the majority of the membership of the church would move to the Missouri, which would be the second historical headquarters of the church, and then on from there to Nauvoo, Illinois. Eventually, as the saints left Kirtland, Ohio, they traveled here to Missouri. And as new saints were being baptized and converted to the church, they immigrated here. I'm standing at a spot that Joseph Smith recognized and dedicated as Adam on Diamond. It is known in the church history as the place where Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. So you can imagine that this area is considered very sacred to members of the church. However, as more and more converts came in and as more and more people moved from Kirtland area and settled here, eventually the locals began fearing the members of the church and fighting them over political power. They kept them from voting, and soon skirmishes broke out between the groups. Eventually, church leadership were imprisoned, and the governor issued an extermination order where mobs then began to attack Mormon settlements. So after a short period of time, the church was forced to leave this area, leave this sacred area, which they considered very important to their religious ideas and history, and they moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. I'm standing in front of the Nauvoo Temple, which was built here by the saints after they had been pushed out of Missouri. They came here to establish a new gathering, a new place where they could live in peace and they could gather the saints together. And at one point, this had been a successful settlement for them. But as it happened in other places, persecution followed, and soon the saints were forced to leave. They had to leave even before this temple was finished. And in fact, as they were preparing to leave, they continued pushing forward with the termination of the temple so that they could seal their families together and make promises in the temple to obey the Lord and to sacrifice, if they had to, everything they had, which is in fact what they ended up doing, sacrificing it all before they headed out across the Great Plains to the Great Basin. Looking back at this moment, one church leader who later became a president of the church, Wilford Woodruff, said, "I stopped my carriage on top of a rolling prairie. I had a splendid view. I could see the saints pouring out and gathering like clouds from the hills and dales and groves and prairie with their teams, their wagons, their flocks, and their herds. And by the hundreds and thousands, as it were, it looked like their movement was of a great nation." Thinking back at that moment, George Buchanan, a leader of the church in those days, said, "Those of us who can remember when we were compelled to abandon Nauvoo, when the winter was so inclement, know how dark and gloomy the circumstances of the saints were. With the mob surrounding our outer settlements and threatening to destroy us, and how trying it was to the faith of the people of God. The word was to cross the Mississippi and to branch out into the unknown wilderness. To go where? No one knew. Who knew anything of the terrors of the journey thither, or of the dangers that might have to be met and contended with? Who knew anything about the country to be traversed? Moving out with faith that was undisturbed by its unknown terrors. It was by faith that this was accomplished." I'm standing at a monument in Omaha, Nebraska, honoring those pioneers who died here. On February 24th, 1846, the Mississippi River froze, and that allowed thousands of Mormon pioneers to escape their beloved city of Nauvoo. And then over the next 4 months, they inched their way through rain, mud, and snow until they reached the banks of the Missouri River just to the east of us. On the Nebraska side of the river, in current Omaha, Nebraska, they established this place, which they called winter quarters. This became a staging ground in preparation for the 1,000-mile journey west of here to Utah. In 1847 and 1848, under the leadership of Brigham Young, nearly 4,000 people left here on their way west. And over the years that followed, there were thousands and thousands more. I'm standing at the cemetery and this monument that really is honoring those dead that died here. It exemplifies the perseverance and the dedication of those Latter-day Saints who moved west from this spot. At winter quarters, there were over 600 people who died, half of those children, and half of those are buried here. As is said in a hymn that was written by William Clayton, "And should we die before our journey's through, happy day, all is well. We then are free from toil and sorrow too, and with the just we too shall dwell. But if our lives are spared again to see the saints their rest obtain, oh, how we'll make this chorus swell, all is well, all is well." In one last quote, I'm reading from Heber J. Grant, who is also one of the pioneers and leaders of the church who left here. This spot, he says, has sometimes been called the tragedy of winter quarters, but there was no tragedy here. For tragedy spells defeat and disaster, but this was victory of winter quarters. For here was faith and hope and charity raised to their loftiest pinnacle, while greed and selfishness were brought low. This spot marks the commemoration of where Brigham Young looked up from his sick bed at that time and looked over the Salt Lake Valley and said, "This is the right place." You can imagine, after a journey of some 1,200 miles, what these pilgrims felt when they came here. They had arrived at a place of safety. They had arrived at a place where they could build their temple. They had arrived at a place where they could do the sealings in the temple, sealing their families together as one, and also gathering together in their minds the house of Israel from the four corners of the earth to this very spot. And over the decades that followed, tens of thousands journeyed to this very spot, following the exact same trail that we have followed along here to get to this spot. It was here in the security of the Great Basin at the foot of the Rocky Mountains that they found the security, the safety, and the isolation that they needed to build Zion here on the earth. I believe that pilgrims, once inspired, need to magnify their own beliefs, their own strengths, and magnify those of others. This trail inspires that type of magnification. It inspires members of the church to look for their roots, whether literal descendants of the pilgrims, of these pioneers, or spiritual inheritance of that heritage that they have as members of the church, being baptized wherever they're at in the world.